I want to know one ancestor in your family tree that you are stuck on. So the name of the ancestor or the relationship that they are to you, and then what it is about them that you would like to know. So one ancestor you're stuck on and what it is that you would like to know about them. So if you could just type that into the chat or type that into the comments here on YouTube, that would be fantastic. That's going to help me start to understand a little bit, and I'm going to pay attention to the chat here live about exactly where you're going to get stuck, because I have an hour of time prepared for us together today to walk through exactly the 5 reasons why most people get stuck in my decades of experience, and then some really actionable tips for you about exactly what you can do to get unstuck. And so if you've already got somebody in mind that you're stuck on, that means that you're going to be more easily able to connect the dots between what I'm teaching and exactly what you need to do. So some of you might want to get out a pen and paper or pull up a notes app on your phone so that you can type in some of the things that you're learning, because as I talk about these things, because you've got that person in your mind, you're more likely to think, oh, I have this thing I want to try specifically that Crista just said. And I want you to be able to capture that, because when we're done, I want you to actually go and do the thing on Ancestry. And if you've forgotten it because you didn't write it down, then you'll have to come back and watch the video, which is fine. But I always love spending time with you. But I want you to be able to have success in finding that. So as I'm looking through the comments that are coming in on the live chat, some of you have really close ancestors that you're stuck on. I think the very first one I saw was a maternal grandfather. I didn't see any more than that, but lots of reasons why people get stuck. And that is sometimes it's a close-in relative, sometimes it's a more distant relative. Most of you that I'm seeing, you're getting stuck in about the great-grandparent level. I'm seeing lots of 2 times great-grandparents. I'm seeing a lot of you who are stuck in Ireland. That's no surprise. Some of you are stuck at the 3rd great-grandparent level. And yeah, like some of you are just trying to identify specifically where that person is from or who their parents are. So those seem to be the 2 things that you're looking for the most. It's always interesting to me that people talk about how I can't find anything. And so one of the things I want you to start thinking about is, obviously you know something about this person because you know they exist. You know they had a child, right? Because that child is your ancestor. And so there are some things you know about maybe when they lived, not maybe exact birth or death dates, but you have some idea of at least the century, maybe even a group of decades because of when their child was born. And you have some idea of where they may have lived at least one point in their life because of the existence of that child. So one of the things that I want you to first start thinking about is just the way you think about the things that you get stuck on. Because saying, oh, I don't know anything, or I can't find anything, that kind of mindset tends to keep us stuck. So for me, as a professional genealogist for decades, one of the things that I have found that helps me get unstuck the fastest is just to change the way I'm thinking about things. So that's just a quick little tip before we dive into the 5 reasons why people get stuck and what to do about it. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to share my screen, and we are going to dive right into these 5 reasons. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. That's always the challenge with Zoom, right? There we go. Okay. So here's what we're covering today. 5 reasons you are not finding your ancestor and what to do about it. So get ready with your notes, because I think some of these things are going to hit home or strike true for some of you. So the first reason is that you are putting too much emphasis on family stories. Now, here is what I mean by that. A lot of you have family stories, and that's how you started your family tree. And that's exactly how you should start your family tree, is with the information that you collect from your living family members. You start a family tree with yourself. You add your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and uncles and your cousins, and then maybe you talk to a parent or grandparent and you add what you know about their parents and their grandparents. And that's how most trees get started. However, you have to keep in mind that as you're collecting that information, two things are true. One is the information people are giving you is only as good as their memory. And the information people are giving you is only as good as what they've been told. So I'm not saying grandma lied to you. What I'm saying is, by the time she told you what she told you about where her grandpa was from, her memory might not have been as clear or as sharp, or her grandpa may have lied to her or made up stories, or she may have misunderstood, or he may have said something to her once when she was a child and she didn't quite understand it exactly correct. So let me give you a specific example in my family. In my family, one of my immigrant ancestors came in the 1850s from Germany. They settled in the hill country of Texas, and they spoke German. My great-grandmother, who I knew, was born in Texas, but German was her first language. She was born in a German household. She went to a German church. She attended, for the first few years of her life, a school in that German community where everybody else, including the teachers and all the students, spoke German. So she didn't learn English until she was a child and went to an upper grade school. Our whole family has always been told that they came from Germany. Well, as we started digging into it, what we discovered is they actually came from what was at the time called Prussia and is now within the borders of Poland. So when you go looking for information, if you rely solely on the stories that you've been told, you need to keep in mind that that information is only as good as the memory of the person who was told that, who shared it with you. It's only as good as the person who told them was providing that information. And historical context may come into play. So if your family came from a place like Prussia that no longer exists, or a place like the Austro-Hungarian Empire that no longer exists, or even a place like Germany where the borders have changed repeatedly over time through centuries, you need to understand the historical context of that time and place in order to be successful and to get past this particular hurdle. Now, let me give you another example from my own family that might apply. Like, again, you're thinking about your specific place you're stuck and how what I'm sharing might apply to you. So one of my brick walls, actually my most persistent and most close-in brick wall in my family tree, is an Irish great-great-grandfather. Now, we call him the Irish great-great-grandfather because his name is John O'Brien. The problem is that he liked to tell stories. And as information got passed down in the family from him to his daughters, from his daughters to their children and nieces and nephews, and then ultimately to me, here's what we know about John O'Brien. He was born in either 1832 or 1837 or 1842, depending on which story you believe. And he was born in either Iowa or Ohio or Ireland, depending on which story you believe. So as we've been working through this, when we originally started researching this family tree and trying to find this ancestor, the story that had been passed down in our family was that he immigrated from Ireland with his father as a child. That's the story he told his daughter. That's the story that she told her children. When my great-grandmother passed when my grandfather was really young, but that's the story that his older siblings told him, and that's the story ultimately that he told my mom. And so as my mom went in search of how to solve this problem, how to find John O'Brien, she went in with the assumption that, oh, he immigrated from Ireland as a child with his father. And so that was all the places that we were looking for him were based on that information. Well, as we gathered his Civil War service record, we uncovered that he enlisted in the Civil War from Iowa. As we started pulling up census records from his lifetime, we found that in some censuses, it was reported, maybe even by him, that he was born in Ohio. So now we have 3 possible birth locations, a wide range of possible birth years, a family story that may or may not be true. And as we've started to unravel it, the current hypothesis that my mom and I are working on is that he was actually born in Ohio, and that the story that he told his children was maybe about his father, that his father came from Ireland as a child with his dad. Not that John himself came from Ireland as a child with his dad. So as you start to investigate those family stories and question the assumptions that you've made because of them, one of the things to keep in mind is that there is often a kernel of truth in those stories. The information, much like a game of telephone, just got sometimes distorted as it was passed down in the family tree. There are a lot of family legends that end up like this. Some of you may have been told your whole life that you were Native American, when in fact, possibly your family just lived in Indian territory, either in Oklahoma or maybe in North Carolina, and associated with the Native Americans. And as you get your DNA test results and start building out your family tree, you can't find any evidence that your family was Native American, but some of you cling to that story because that's the story that has been passed down generation after generation. Some of you have a family story that your ancestor came through Ellis Island, and you've been looking and looking and looking at New York passenger lists and you can't find your person. Well, maybe it's because they didn't actually come through Ellis Island. Maybe that was just the assumption that was made, or the way that the information got distorted through passing it down generation after generation. Maybe they came through the port of Philadelphia or Boston or Charleston or New Orleans or San Francisco or Seattle. Maybe they came in through another port entirely. So understanding what the options are, understanding the context of history, things like the fact that Ellis Island didn't even open until 1892. That becomes important in helping you get unstuck. So the number one reason you're not finding your ancestor is because you could be putting too much emphasis on family stories. And the solution for that is to just start questioning those stories, keep an open mind, and look into the historical context of what was possible based on that family story. Okay, let me just double check and see if there are any questions that have come in specific to that while we have been sitting here. It doesn't look so. Looks like we're doing good. Okay, so let's move on. If you have specific questions, by all means, put them in the Q&A. Our member services staff can answer those questions, but try to stick to the topic at hand. That would be helpful for all of us. A little bit of healthy skepticism is a practical strategy here for making sure we can overcome this stuck problem. But keep in mind, there's oftentimes a kernel of truth there. Okay, let's look at reason number 2 why you are sometimes getting stuck looking for your ancestors. And that is the foundation that you have built your family tree on might have been faulty to begin with. And so one of the things that gets people stuck faster than anything is just copying information from other people's family trees without verifying that that information is correct. Okay, so Ancestry, of course, we have, I think, 164 million family trees on the site. And that is fantastic because it means there are clues everywhere. Family trees can be used as a source. Now, an online family tree at Ancestry, no different than a book that may have been published by somebody about their family history back in 1893. Both have clues, but both need to have sources in order for you to validate that the information is correct. So if you've just accepted information from somebody's family tree, whether it was some hint you were delivered on Ancestry, or whether it was your Aunt Sally who gave you a file folder full of things that she had put together decades ago, it still requires you to go through and validate that information. Now, one of the questions I get asked is, well, why would a family tree be wrong? Well, family trees are wrong for a lot of reasons. One is, see reason number one, people have just entered information into their family tree based on what they've been told. For a long time, John O'Brien was in my family tree with a birthplace of Ireland because we believed that story. I've since updated that information to say Ohio because that's our current working hypothesis, and we're still trying to prove whether or not that is true. But in the time that it said Ireland, there could have been dozens of people who copied that information out of my family tree. And there was no way of knowing who copied it or to notify them when I've updated my hypothesis or when I finally discover the truth to go back and update all of that information. So keep in mind that if you've copied stuff from somebody's tree, that tree may have been a work in progress, not a conclusion about actual facts. The other reason that this is sometimes a challenge for people is because we want so much to just jump back in our tree. Like, I think some of us come into family history super excited to just build a big tree as fast as we can. And then we think, oh, and then I'll go back and like redo the information or look for sources or learn the stories about these people. The challenge with that is that in the process of doing that, sometimes we create what I like to call Franken people, right? Sometimes we conflate information about 2 or 3 or 7 different individuals into one identity. And now we've got jumbled information about this person and their relationships and their life events. And that gets us stuck because we've copied that information. We've made a person that didn't really exist. And so, of course, you can't find who her parents are because this person, as you've got them in your tree, doesn't really exist. And so that's one of the challenges or pitfalls that sometimes happens when we just copy information or try to climb a family tree quickly with the intention of going back later to find documentation or records or DNA evidence or other verification that this person really is a person, that these really are their life facts. So I'm going to invite you, as a way to overcome this, to slow down and to do one person or one family group at a time in your family tree. One of the ways you can overcome this particular reason you get stuck is by looking, if you're looking at somebody else's tree, look at the documentation they have attached. If they have no documentation attached, go and look and see if they are closely related to this person. So you go to the tree, you look at who the home person is, and if you see the person in their pedigree within just 1 or 2 generations, you can have a higher degree of confidence that maybe they know something about this person. Maybe they knew them personally. But if they're a distant relative somewhere out in a far branch of their family tree and they have no source citations attached, maybe it requires you to go and do a little bit more investigation before you add that person to your family tree. Now, if they do have a bunch of sources, you're going to want to look at those sources. Look at that census record. Look at that find a grave record. Look at the records the person has attached. Make sure they actually are for the person that they say it is, and that the records they've attached are all for this person. Again, not a conglomeration of records of the same people or of multiple people with the same name. That's one thing I see people do. And it's so normal. When you're getting started, you don't know any better, you're still learning. Everybody does that. One of the things I often say is that the moment that you delete your tree and start over is the moment you become a real genealogist, because you realize, oh, I just was enthusiastic and excited and maybe wasn't following best practices, or maybe didn't build my tree out the way that I'm actually climbing my own family tree and not somebody else's because I took a misstep somewhere. And so when you slow down and you review those sources, look at those records, look at the other hints that you have in your family tree for those people, the hints to census records and passenger lists and birth, marriage, and death records, you're more likely to be tracing the right people and not to create those Franken people in your family tree. Now, if you really want to do this, not get stuck in this way, here's what I would recommend. I would recommend actually not even looking at other people's family trees first. I would do that much later. Now, I do use other people's family trees. I use them for clues. I go looking for information to see who knows what and who's related to who. But I always look at records first. And if I'm researching a family here in the United States or in Canada or in England, I'm always going to use the census records first, because they provide a scaffolding for the family identity that I can then build on with additional records. And so think about records first instead of just accepting or copying information from someone else's family tree or using those potential parent hints in Ancestry, which ultimately are pulling from other people's family trees. You can look at them, but make sure you're looking at the records first. Okay, so this problem of using unsourced trees as your starting point, I just want to make sure you understand, records first. One of the other things you can do is you can contact the tree owner. So anytime you're viewing a family tree on Ancestry, let me just stop sharing my screen real quickly so that I can flip over to sharing from Ancestry. We're going to do this. We're going to share a tree. There we go. Okay, you should now be seeing my family tree on your screen. That's my cute grandpa there. And this is, he is listed currently as the focus person. So I'm the home person, but he's the focus person. So this is a view of his tree. And I can go into any person in this tree and I can look at the hints that I have from other people's trees. So I come here and I go to hints, and Ancestry will show me the way that he is connected to other people's trees. So one of those other trees kinds of databases is the Geneanet Community Trees Index. So Geneanet is a French company, and family trees are built on their platform. Ancestry purchased that company recently, and now we have access to the index to the trees on that website. And so I can look at it, but when I look at this hint, I want to click through to Geneanet, and then I want to look and see who owns that tree, and then I want to maybe contact the tree owner. So I can click through using the link on that record page to Geneanet, and then I can see who owns this particular tree, and I can contact this person. I can do that with Geneanet tree hints. I can also do that with Ancestry tree hints or search results. So if I click search from my tree, it's going to take me to Ancestry search results. And what I can do is I can filter down to just family tree results. So over here on the filters on the left-hand side, I can click family trees, and this will show me all the family trees on Ancestry that are connected to Park. And it looks like there are 162 trees on Ancestry that he shows up in. Mine, of course, shows up as the first search result because I think probably because I have the most information about him. But you'll see here he is in this tree. It's a private tree, so I can contact the tree owner directly from here. Here he is in somebody else's tree. This is a public tree. And so I can come over here to this public tree. And right up here in the top, I can see the name of the tree owner. And I can click on that, and it will allow me to message that tree owner through Ancestry. So if they don't have sources, or if I have questions about the sources that he has attached, I can message them. So that's something that I want to strongly encourage you to do, which is if you're using other people's trees, and we want you to interact with each other. If my second cousin is also researching the origins of John O'Brien, I want to collaborate with her. I want to message her and see what she knows and combine it with the information that I know and see if we can't come to some conclusions together or make a next steps plan for our research by doing that. So use other people's trees, absolutely, but just don't use them first. Look at records first wherever possible. And if you're going to use their trees, try to see what information they have collected about that person in the sources and in the comments and in the gallery of that profile page, and or message them so that you can see if they are willing to collaborate further, or if possibly they have information about this person that you can't see. That actually happens to me a lot, which is I do a lot of my thinking and analysis and source citations in my notes, and my notes are private. And so if you contact me about any person in my tree, I can go into the notes and I can copy and paste that information to you. And I do. I'm willing to do that if you find something in my tree. Okay, let's move on to reason number 3, why you are getting stuck in trying to find an ancestor. Reason number 3 is, let's see if we can get this to advance. There we go. You are searching for records that don't exist. Here's what I mean by that. One of the things that I see people do a lot, even people who have been doing family history for a while or who have some experience, is you are looking for great-great-grandma's birth certificate, and I can't find it anywhere, and so I'm stuck. Well, the reality is that there might not be a birth certificate for great-great-grandma. Here's the analogy that I like to use. Some of you, this will put off a light bulb in your head, okay? There's this story that's told about this man who in the middle of the night was out in the middle of the street under a street lamp, and he was like down on the ground and looking for something. And the neighbor looked out his window and he saw his neighbor doing this, and so he went out and he said, "Hey buddy, what are you doing?" And he said, "I'm looking for my car keys." And the guy was like, "Oh no, let me help." And so now they're both down on the ground looking for the car keys. And after a few minutes of looking and not having any success, the neighbor says to the man, he says, "Well, where did you lose your keys?" And he said, "Well, I think I lost them somewhere between my front door and the car." And he said, "Well, then why are we out here in the middle of the night, in the middle of the street, under this street lamp, looking for your car keys if you lost them over there?" And he said, "Well, because the light is better here." Right? I think sometimes we approach our searching like that, which is we just take the path of least resistance, or the path that's lit up the most, instead of thinking through where is the place I'm most likely to find this information. So when you look under the street lamp, that's not always the place you're going to find it. So one of the things you might need to do is redirect that light to the place where you should be looking. So I want you to start to understand what records exist and where you can find them. Here in the United States, we have kept a U.S. federal level census since 1790. The census is taken every 10 years. Still, the last census was taken in 2020. However, that census is private for 72 years, which means the most recent publicly available census is 1950. So sometimes I see people, again, like everybody was new once, we don't know what we don't know, asking, how come I can't find my family in the 1960 census? Well, it's because the 1960 census is not publicly available yet. I see sometimes people saying, I can't find my great grandma in the 1890 census. Well, that's because the 1890 census was destroyed in a fire and then the subsequent water damage from that fire. I see people saying, well, I can't find my dad's World War II service records. It's because there was a fire in 1973 in the St. Louis Personnel Records Office. I see people say things like, I can't find my great-grandfather's birth record in Florida. Well, that's because Florida didn't start keeping birth records at a state level until the 1940s. So again, like starting to just ask those questions, like everybody should ask those questions. And then as a community, we will help you understand what records exist and what records don't exist. One of my favorite features on the entire Ancestry website, if you've spent any time with me at all in genealogy conferences or online in YouTube or in any of my social media channels, like you know that I love the Ancestry card catalog. And the reason I love the Ancestry card catalog so much is because it answers this question. What records exist on Ancestry? So that's a first place that every one of you can start. So again, let me share my Ancestry screen so that you can see exactly what it is that I'm talking about and follow along. On Ancestry, if you click on the search button up here and go to the card catalog, that is a listing, a current listing of, as of today, all 33,777 databases full of records available on Ancestry. And you can search this card catalog for any state or record type. Those are the two most popular ways to search it. So for example, I just used Florida. We'll type that in. If I just type in Florida and click search, you'll see that 83 of those 33,000 databases on Ancestry are specific to Florida. And then I can filter that by record type. So I can say, actually, I want to see what birth records exist for Florida. There is one database that has information about births in Florida, and it is not a database of birth records because Florida birth records didn't start being kept till the 1940s, and they have a privacy law that means that those records aren't published online. So you can then go out to any internet search and type in, for example, Florida birth records or Georgia birth records or New York birth records or Germany birth records. So after you've searched the card catalog on Ancestry, go out and do a little searching to see what exists elsewhere. So Ancestry currently has, I think, 68 billion records on the site. We add an average of about 5 million new records to the site every single day. It's another use of the card catalog, is you can see exactly what new records have been added here. That's the default sort for this list. But there are records that exist elsewhere. Sometimes those records, like the Florida births, are held by the State Vital Records Office. And they haven't put them online yet, but if you are a child or a grandchild or a great-grandchild of that person, you can order a copy of that record directly from the State Vital Records Office. In some places, like Virginia, for example, there are records that the state archive has digitized and put on their website. And so again, you can go to their website and see if those records are available. And then if they are, you can link them to your family tree. So here's the best place to do that. When you're on a person profile page, if you come down here in the center of the sources column, these are all the records from Ancestry that I've attached to my tree about Park. here's all the records from newspapers.com that I've attached to Park. And then right down here at the bottom of that column, I can add a web link. So if that record exists on the Virginia State Archives, or if it exists on the, on another website somewhere, you can put a link to that record and then give that link a name so that you have that information. If it's a birth certificate that you ordered from the state and the state doesn't have any terms and conditions that prohibit it, you can upload a copy of that image to the gallery for this person. And now you can have a copy of the actual record in the gallery for this person on your family tree. So lots of different ways to look and see if the records that exist on Ancestry, or if the records exist on Ancestry, or if those records exist somewhere else. And there's a lot of reasons records don't exist. Things like fires or natural disasters, things like people that didn't comply with laws. So for example, in England, they started keeping birth records at a countrywide level in 1837. But not everybody registered the birth of their child for a couple of decades. And so from 1837 to about 1856, there's not complete compliance with the law. And so not every birth of every child was recorded. But by about 1856, we have almost 100% compliance, which means if they were born from that date on, you should be able to find a specific birth record. So just understanding what records began being kept at what time, in what places, and then what the privacy laws about those records are, and then if there has been any record loss. That's going to help you overcome this particular brick wall or stuck point, I think, a little bit faster than continuing to just do searches or wait for hints from Ancestry. Okay, that brings me to reason number 4 why you might not be finding your ancestors. And that is that you get stuck in a search rut. Now, number 3 and number 4 are very related to one another here, but here's what I mean by this. I see people all the time think that if they can just do the right search on Ancestry, or the right search on Family Search, or the right search on the State Archives website, that they'll find the record that they're looking for. There are different ways to search on Ancestry that often yield different results. So don't just wait for hints to be delivered to you. Hints are just low-hanging fruit that Ancestry is showing you, saying, we think this information in this record matches this information that you've put in your family tree. And that's great as a starting point. It may or may not actually be your person. It could just be somebody with a similar name, or it could be somebody that someone else accidentally attached to their tree for that same person. So you do need to review those hints, but don't just rely on hints. Some of you click that search button like I just did from the profile page for Park in my family tree, and that's how you always search. You just kind of get stuck in a rut of like, I'm just going to throw everything I know about this person at the search engine and see what happens. That's a great first search step. But there are so many more ways to search. For example, if you know you're looking for a birth record, go to the birth records search on Ancestry and search just the birth records. If you know you're looking for a passenger list, go specifically to the passenger list search form and search specifically for the passenger lists. Because every search form on Ancestry has different fields and therefore different information that's going to be returned in those search results. So when I click search from my tree here, it's using this search all collections form and algorithm to interact with the search engine. But if I know I'm looking for a passenger list, for example, I'm going to come down here to immigration and travel, and then I'm going to additionally filter to passenger lists. I'm going to narrow that down to just search those databases on Ancestry that have this kind of record in it. So get used to using, there are tens of thousands of different search forms on Ancestry and get used to using the different search forms to make those discoveries. Additionally, if one of the ways that you're stuck is you can't find somebody in a particular census, from the card catalog, you can just type in the year of the census, and then I can come in here and I can search just that specific database. I can search just the 1870 census. And in that case, I can get all kinds of wild with wildcards. I can do no-name searches. We don't have time today to go over all of the different ways that you can search, but if you go to ancestry.com/education, all of our past Wednesday virtual events are listed there on that page. And there is a video there that is just a whole hour of search tips and tricks that will help you understand better how to mine these databases in different ways to find the information that you are looking for. Because getting stuck in a search rut is, like I said, one of the ways that people get themselves stuck. Now, the other thing to think about is we talked about whether or not those birth, marriage, or death records exist, but start thinking about other records that might exist that have the same information. So for example, we'll go back to Florida. If Florida didn't start keeping birth records until the 1940s, well, then how do I find a birth date for someone born in Florida before that? Well, there are other records that often have birth information on them. For example, a death certificate often has a birth date. An obituary often has a birth date. A tombstone often has a birth date. There could have been church records created. So just because the government didn't start keeping birth records until then, maybe the child was baptized or christened in the family's faith, and there are church records that exist that list both the baby's birth date and their baptismal date. So one of the things that you could be looking at, one of the ways to move that spotlight is to start asking the question, what was the religious denomination that this family belonged to? Were they Catholic? Were they, Anglican? Like, where am I going to find church records? Ancestry does have a lot of church records online, so does Family Search. Sometimes you have to do a little bit of digging, but you can find birth information there. Another place that you might find birth information is through delayed birth certificates. So sometimes, particularly people who were born kind of at the latter end of the 1800s, before states started officially keeping birth records, they would go in sometimes decades later to apply for a delayed birth certificate because they needed it to apply for Social Security or for military benefits or for other reasons. And so there might be in a database of delayed birth certificates, a birth certificate for a person 60, 70 years after their birth. Census records, they're not a birth certificate, but they do contain age and birthplace. And when you string together a lifetime of, censuses, I found them in 1880 and 1900 and 1910 and 1920, and I can track their age, and it might be a little different in every census, but I can get an about year that they were born. And I can look at the birthplace on all of those census records. And if it's consistent, that's a good sign. If it's inconsistent, I will probably need to find some additional evidence. Thank you, John O'Brien. But I can put in my best hypothesis at the moment. And sometimes that's just the name of a state or a country. And that's good enough to keep you moving forward. What I do not recommend is leaving those fields blank because you don't have a specific birth date or a specific birthplace. So I will often put in about 1842 in Ohio because that's my current best hypothesis. Another place where you can find birth information is on military records. So if your grandfather or great-grandfather registered for the World War I or World War II draft, particularly World War I, those men were often born before the turn of the century. And sometimes in places where birth records were not kept. But on that World War I draft card, they were required to list their birth date and their birthplace. In addition to that, if they served in the military, their military enlistment records, and if their service records survived the personnel records fire, they might also list birth dates. Another thing to keep in mind is newspapers. So newspapers sometimes list birth announcements in local papers, and sometimes there are unique mentions. One of my favorite solves for an unknown birth date was I found this little snippet, literally like 2 lines in a single column in a local newspaper in the town where the baby's grandmother lived. And all it said was something to the effect of, Mrs. John Smith just returned home after 2 weeks visiting her daughter in St. Louis, who just had a new baby last week. Like, and now I knew that that baby had been born, where the family was living, and I didn't have an exact date, but I had a week, right? So I could put in they were born April 1897, and now I have more information. There are also sometimes school records, and so pay attention to that. Now, if you're looking for a marriage record, similar kinds of places. Not all states kept marriage records through all time, okay? Different states, different countries have kept them different ways. England started doing it in 1837. Massachusetts started keeping them at a town level in the 1600s, but some places didn't start until much later. But there are other places you can find marriage dates. Again, look for church records, not just civil records. Look for marriage bonds and marriage licenses. So even if there wasn't a marriage certificate or a marriage record, there might be a bond or a license. Newspaper announcements. Census records. Some of the early 1900s census records list the number of years the couple has been married or how old each of them was when they were first married. You have to do a little math, both to figure out how long ago this person was first married, but also keep in mind that that's a great way to find a clue about whether this is a first or second marriage for this couple. Because if he is 30 and he was first married at 18, and she is 28 and she was first married at 25, she's not his first wife, right? So you can do that math and figure that out. And then military pension files. So whenever a woman had to apply to the federal government for a pension for her Civil War or Revolutionary War ancestor, one of the things she often had to provide was proof of marriage. And so sometimes they would just rip the page right out of the family Bible and send it in with the application because there were no copy machines back then, right? Sometimes there would be an affidavit filled out by somebody who was present at the wedding, like an older sibling or a parent that was present at the wedding. And so you've got documentation oftentimes in those pension files of those marriages. Property and tax records are a good indication. If there's a change in property ownership, sometimes that can indicate a marriage happened, and that gives you a time frame for when that marriage occurred. In many states throughout much of the 1700s and 1800s, and a lot of different countries as well, women could own property if they were single or widowed, but as soon as they married, the ownership of their property reverted to their husband. And so that's why property records can serve as a good indicator that a marriage has occurred. If a woman is appearing on tax lists and then all of a sudden she disappears from the tax lists, that could be an indication that she got married or remarried because now her husband owns the property that's being taxed. And then sometimes you can just use the children as the indicator. And that's going to bring us to our last reason in just a minute. Let me give you a few quick alternatives for death dates. So Death certificates, again, if a death certificate doesn't exist, is there an obituary? Is there a funeral notice? Is there a church record about a funeral or a burial? Are there cemetery records? Probate records, whether the person had a lot of property or not, whether they left a will or not, sometimes that property has to be probated, and it can either be with a will or without a will. Sometimes there's guardianship appointments for minor children, and that's an indication that a father has passed. Property transfers, all of a sudden a woman showing up in tax records, that's an indication that her husband has possibly just passed. City directories, mortality schedules. So lots of different places that you can go to find the information that you're looking for. But so many of us sometimes get stuck in a search rut of just throwing everything at the search engine to see what pops up instead of thinking intentionally about what kind of information I'm looking for, and then shining that spotlight on exactly where I might be able to find that information and searching there specifically. Okay, reason number 5, we're going to bring it home. That you are not finding your ancestor could be because you are not looking at their entire life. One of the things that I see people do very often is that they get really hung up on, I'm trying to find the parents, I'm trying to find the parents. And they haven't actually fleshed out the full life of this person first, meaning they haven't identified all the spouses. They haven't identified when and where this person died, or if they served in the military, or if they own property. They haven't listed all of the children of this person. All of that information is a really good story, right? I love doing family history because I love finding the stories of the people. I want to get to know these people, not just see how big I can build my family tree. And so I want to know everything about them and everything about their life and who they interacted with, and not even necessarily just their immediate family. One of the new features that Ancestry introduced within just the last few months is called networks. Those of you who have Ancestry Pro tools have access to networks now while it's in beta, and it allows you to create entire groups of people around your ancestor. Who did they work with? Who did they worship with? Who did they serve in the military with? Who did they migrate with? You can add all of that information to your ancestors network. And again, not only does it make a great story, but it also ensures that you're identifying the right people in the records, and it gives you an increased likelihood that you will be able to then not only find the parents, but that when you find them, you've identified the right people. Again, I always want you to be climbing your family tree and not somebody else's because you took a left turn somewhere. So the more you know about this person and their entire life, the more likely you are to be able to make sure that you've got the right person and that you're making the right connections. When we focus too narrowly on, oh, I just want to find the parents and the parents and the parents, we miss valuable context and valuable connections, in addition to valuable stories. So here are just some tips that you can do to overcome this particular reason you might be getting stuck. Think about the timeline of your ancestor's life. In your ancestry tree on the profile page, we start a timeline for you based on the information you enter and the records you attach. But what else could you add to that timeline? What other things could you uncover or discover about them? Be sure to add all the children in a family, not just the one child that you're a descendant of. Adding all of those children increases the likelihood that you'll find other records that exist that mention the members of the family and might ultimately lead you to the information you're wanting to find. Look for migration patterns. So for example, for those of you, myself included, who are all stuck in Ireland, one of the things that you need to do is understand the different emigration waves out of Ireland, like when in history those occurred, and then when people were leaving Ireland, where they came to in the United States. You might be looking in the wrong place. We talk about Hill Country Germans and the Chicago Polish and the Boston Irish. Like that, we talk about that because those were often patterns of migration for different immigrant groups at different times in history. And so starting to kind of understand that a little bit means that you'll know other places you could look. Re-look at your family tree and particularly that family group and look for evidence of blended families and multiple marriages. One of the reasons you might be getting stuck is because this man married two women named Elizabeth. You didn't realize there were actually two wives named Elizabeth, and you've assigned all of the children to one or the other of those wives. And you can't understand why you keep getting stuck or why your DNA matches aren't connecting you to her family when in fact you might be a descendant of the other wife. Look for gaps in the ages of children. That is a good indicator that you might be missing a child or that there might be missing events or migratory events in the person's life. So all of those are things that you can do to overcome that particular problem. Well, an hour always goes way too fast, but ultimately my goal in showing up here on our Wednesday virtual events and serving you in this way is to help you continue to make discoveries in your family tree. So if you're struggling to find your ancestors, any of your ancestors, the 5 reasons that you might be getting stuck are putting too much emphasis on your family stories, using unsourced trees as a starting point, searching for records that don't exist, being stuck in a search rut, and not looking at your ancestors' entire life. What I want to know from you now in the comments is if you think one of those reasons might be why you're stuck on a particular family, or if you had a particular aha or thing you learned today or heard or took a note about today that you want to go try as soon as we're done here. So I love that feedback for me so that I can continue to provide these Wednesday virtual event topics in a way that serves you best. But I also want you to articulate what you learned today because then you're more likely to remember it. So that's what we have today. That's all I have prepared for you today. I hope this was a helpful and useful hour for you. I really want you to have success in climbing your family tree. And, if any of you know anything about my John O'Brien, born in about 1842 in Ohio, maybe, I'd love to hear from you as well. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.